December 1942. In a forgotten corner of an airfield in New Guinea, a single B-25 Mitchell bomber sat shrouded in the humid mist of the jungle dawn. But this was no ordinary bomber. Its nose was torn apart, its bomb bay stripped, and in its place, 8.50 caliber machine guns gleamed beneath the rising sun. The man behind it stood in oil-stained khakis, his face hardened by sun and war. Captain Paul Pappy Gunn, a former airline mechanic turned combat legend, had just broken every regulation in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Officially, the B-25 was a medium bomber meant to hit targets from the sky. Unofficially, Gunn had turned it into a low-flying monster, an airborne shotgun built to shred Japanese convoys at treetop height. When a superior officer first saw it, he nearly fainted. Who authorized this modification? Gunn just grinned. No one, sir. The enemy did. He wasn't exaggerating. The Pacific had become a graveyard for Allied bombers, flak, fighters, and jungle weather devouring them daily. Conventional tactics weren't working. Gunn knew it. So he built something unconventional, a weapon of survival. Behind him, the jungle buzzed. Mechanics whispered about the Frankenbomber that no manual described. To them, it was madness. To Pappy Gunn, it was necessity. Soon, the first test flight would decide whether he was a genius or a dead man. Engines roared across the jungle strip, shaking the tin roofs of the maintenance huts. The sound wasn't the smooth hum of a bomber. It was raw, uneven, feral. Gunn's modified B-25 kicked up clouds of dust as it rolled down the short runway, 8 new machine guns glinting beneath its nose like a row of steel teeth. Pilots and ground crew stopped what they were doing. Some crossed their arms, others crossed themselves. Nobody believed this machine could even take off with all that added weight up front. Inside the cockpit, Gunn's hands gripped the controls. Sweat rolled down his temples. "Come on, girl," he muttered, easing the throttles forward. The radial engine screamed. The runway blurred. And then, she lifted. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the jungle below exploded in motion. At just 200 feet, Gunn pushed the throttles again and dove toward a stand of coconut palms. The modified Mitchell howled past the treetops, its shadow flashing across the leaves like a predator in flight. He squeezed the trigger, 8 barrels spat fire. The air vibrated under a deafening storm of .50 caliber rounds. Palm trunks shattered. The test target, an old supply hulk anchored offshore, was shredded within seconds. On the ground, the crew stood speechless. The Frankenbomber hadn't just flown, it had transformed. When Gunn landed, the airstrip echoed with stunned laughter and disbelief. "It works," one mechanic whispered. Gunn stepped down from the cockpit, eyes blazing. "Works," he said. "We just changed the damn rulebook." The next morning, the modified B-25 sat gleaming on the tarmac, its nose packed with 8 blackened barrels still smelling faintly of gunpowder. Word of the flight spread like wildfire through the 3rd Attack Group. Mechanics crowded around the plane, snapping photos and shaking their heads in disbelief. By noon, the whispers had reached headquarters. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead demanded to see the aircraft. Gunn stood at attention beside it, hands clasped behind his back, uniform streaked with oil and dust. Whitehead circled the plane slowly, his boots crunching over gravel. "Captain Gunn," he said finally, "who authorized this modification?" Gunn didn't blink. "No one, sir. We were getting shot out of the sky. I decided to do something about it." Whitehead's face hardened. "You understand this is against Army regulations. You could be court-martialed." "Yes, sir," Gunn replied. "But you can't court-martial results." The general paused, studying the holes the test fire had torn through the target barge. Then he looked back at the waiting crew, dozens of young men whose survival depended on innovation, not red tape. A long silence. Then Whitehead turned to his aide. "Get me General Kenny," he said. "Now." Within hours, photos of the modified Mitchell reached General George Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force. He was a practical man, and he saw what Gunn had done for what it was, a revolution built out of desperation. By nightfall, orders came through from Kenny himself, simple, direct, and history-changing. Approve all field modifications. Gunn's design works. Build more. Within days, the airstrips of Port Moresby roared with activity. Mechanics stripped down B-25 Mitchells under makeshift tarps, sparks flying from welding torches as they carved open the noses of bombers not meant for close-range killing. In came armor plating, ammunition belts, and 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, their barrels gleaming under the tropical sun. The crews called them gunships, though the term didn't exist yet. They were building something entirely new, not a bomber, not a fighter, but a flying battering ram. Major Paul Pappy Gunn moved from hangar to hangar, cigar clenched between his teeth, barking orders, sketching new mount positions in grease pencil directly on the fuselage. "We don't wait for the enemy anymore," he'd growl. "We hunt them." By mid-August, the first squadron of modified B-25s was ready. Each one carried up to 14 forward-firing machine guns, enough to shred a destroyer deck or turn a Japanese transport into burning metal in seconds. Their first test came on a supply convoy near WWII. The formation swept in at treetop height, the lead aircraft opening fire at 1,200 yards. Streams of tracer fire ripped through the morning haze, tearing across decks, fuel drums, and anti-aircraft emplacements. Observers on the ground described it as a wall of fire. In less than 5 minutes, 3 enemy ships were burning, 2 more listing heavily. Not a single American plane was lost. Word spread quickly through the Pacific. The Americans had a new weapon, fast, brutal, and unstoppable. And from that moment, the legend of the Strafer B-25 was born. The success of Pappy Gunn's Strafers sent shockwaves through the U.S. Army Air Forces. What started as a field modification in the jungles of New Guinea was now an official directive, and engineers back home were told to take it even further. At the North American Aviation Plant in Inglewood, California, design teams began work on a new beast, the B-25H Mitchell. Its mission was simple: to destroy ships, tanks, and fortifications with brutal efficiency. They replaced the glazed bomber nose with a solid metal snout, housing 4.50 caliber machine guns. 4 more were built into the fuselage, plus twin mounts on each side blister. When all guns fired, the B-25H unleashed nearly 8,000 rounds per minute, saturating everything ahead in a storm of lead. But engineers weren't done. In the lower fuselage, they mounted a 75mm M4 cannon, the same gun used on the Sherman tank. It was the largest weapon ever fitted to an American aircraft at the time. Each shot shook the entire plane, forcing pilots to brace against the recoil. The shells could punch clean through a steel ship hull or a concrete bunker. Crews joked that the B-25H could sink anything that floats or moves. They weren't exaggerating. In the Pacific, these new gunships flew at mast height, shredding coastal defenses and convoys with impunity. Japanese gunners called them Jigaku no Taka, hawks from hell. Captain Ralph Wallace of the 498th Bomb Squadron remembered, "When that cannon fired, it was like getting hit by a train from behind. The nose dipped, the shell screamed out, and whatever you were aiming at disappeared." By 1944, the B-25H had transformed the concept of air warfare. No longer were bombers helpless without escort. These were predators, self-sufficient, savage, and shockingly effective. And the men who flew them? They weren't just bomber pilots anymore. They were gunship captains, commanding flying tanks in the skies over the Pacific. By late 1943, the Pacific War had reached a boiling point. The Japanese stronghold at Rabaul on the island of New Britain was one of the most heavily defended targets in the world, a fortress city surrounded by flak guns, fighters, and radar. It was the beating heart of Japan's South Pacific defense line. And that's exactly where the new B-25H gunships were sent. Flying at treetop height, sometimes barely 50 feet above the jungle, the pilots of the 38th and 345th Bomb Groups roared toward Rabaul in formation so tight their wingtips nearly touched. They weren't dropping bombs from 6 miles up anymore. They were charging through anti-aircraft fire, face to face with the enemy. As the coastline came into view, hell broke loose. Black flak bursts filled the air. Tracers whipped past the cockpits. Trees and telephone wires flashed beneath the wings as gunners opened fire. 8.50 calories thundered from each aircraft, turning ships and anti-aircraft emplacements into sheets of fire and smoke. One pilot recalled, "We could see the gunners' faces as we came in. You didn't think, you reacted." The nose guns started spitting, and suddenly the whole horizon was burning. Each run over Rabaul lasted barely a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. The Mitchells would strike, pull up over the harbor smoke, and vanish into the clouds as Japanese Zeros scrambled to chase them. These low-level attacks destroyed ships, airfields, and fuel depots that high-altitude bombers had failed to touch for months. The Japanese command was stunned. They called the American tactics suicidal, yet terrifyingly effective. By early 1944, Rabaul was crippled. The base that once housed over 300 aircraft had been reduced to a graveyard of twisted metal and smoking wrecks. For the men who flew those missions, survival was never guaranteed. But every time they returned, blackened with soot and oil, one truth became clear: the low-level B-25s had changed the Pacific War forever. They weren't just pilots and gunners. They were mechanics, mathematicians, and gamblers with their lives on the line. Every man who climbed into a B-25 knew that once those engines roared to life, the odds of returning were a coin toss. The crew of a Mitchell worked like a single organism. The pilot and co-pilot fought to keep the bomber steady, wrestling with vibration and G-forces. The navigator hunched over his maps, tracking every landmark through swirling smoke and jungle. The radio operator tuned through static, calling out bearings, while gunners scanned the sky for incoming fighters, eyes darting, fingers on the triggers, and the cramped glass nose the bombardier, often just 20 years old, aimed through the Norden sight, timing his drop perfectly while tracers screamed past the canopy. The veterans called it organized chaos. The newer crews called it hell in the clouds, T-low altitude. There was no margin for error.
A single flak burst coup de terre à wing-off.
A single zero could set the fuselage ablaze. Yet somehow these men held their course, not out of glory or medals, but because the guy next to them depended on it. One pilot, Captain John Henley, wrote in his diary, "We don't think about fear up there. We think about the formation, the target, and getting everyone home. Fear comes later, when it's quiet." When they landed, engines coughing and wings shredded, the ground crews would swarm in. Bullet holes patched with sheet metal, paint scorched off, oil leaking from every seam, and still those planes would fly again the next morning. Each mission felt like stealing life from death itself. The gunners painted new bomb tallies beneath the cockpit windows, some adding names or jokes to mask the trauma. But behind every grin in the photographs was exhaustion, the kind that comes from seeing friends vanish into smoke mid-sentence. Still they flew.
Again and again.
Because if they didn't, someone else would have to. These were the men who turned machines into legends, ordinary Americans who made the B-25 Mitchell immortal. Beneath the Mitchell's aluminum skin roared a masterpiece of American engineering, the Wright R-2600 Cyclone. It wasn't just an engine. It was a thunderstorm packed into 14 cylinders, each one detonating hundreds of times per minute, each explosion feeding the next, creating the unmistakable growl that pilots called the heartbeat of the Mitchell. At full throttle, the twin cyclones could deliver nearly 3,800 horsepower, enough to haul 10,000 pounds of steel and bombs through tropical air thick as soup. The vibration shook loose rivets, cracked instruments, and left crews half-deaf after every mission. But to those who flew the B-25, that roar was the sound of survival. Mechanics loved and cursed it in equal measure. The Cyclone demanded attention, oil changes after every sortie, constant tuning, and delicate handling on takeoff. Push it too hard, and cylinders would blow. Baby it too much, and you'd never clear the trees at the end of the runway. But when tuned just right, when the fuel mixture was perfect and the prop pitch dialed in, it was a symphony of raw power. Pilots said the plane felt alive, like it wanted to fly itself. And in those desperate low-level attacks across the Pacific, that responsiveness often meant the difference between coming home or vanishing into the sea. The Japanese soon learned to recognize the sound. Long before they saw the Mitchells, they heard that deep, rolling thunder echoing across the islands, a promise of destruction carried on the wind. Engineers back home at Wright Aeronautical never saw combat, but their fingerprints were on every victory. They had turned factory blueprints into wings of vengeance, and their Cyclone engines would go on to power not just bombers, but torpedo planes, patrol craft, and even some of the first post-war airliners. It wasn't the sleekest engine. It wasn't the lightest. But it was tough, dependable, and unstoppable, just like the men who flew behind it. The Wright Cyclone wasn't just the power plant of the B-25. It was its soul. Every rivet, every weld, every bullet hole told the same story. The B-25 Mitchell wasn't born perfect. It was forged in combat. When the first prototypes rolled out, no one imagined this medium bomber would survive the war. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the biggest, and it wasn't built to go toe-to-toe with fighters. But the battlefield has a way of revealing what numbers can't. North Africa. Crews learned the B-25 could take a pounding and still limp home on one engine, wings torn, control cables frayed, fuselage peppered with holes the size of fists. In the Pacific, it became a low-flying menace, skimming treetops to unleash blistering strafing runs that shredded enemy airfields and convoys. The plane's modular design allowed engineers to adapt it faster than any other bomber in the war. Within months, nose-mounted machine guns were added, first 2, then 4, then 8. Some models carried a 75mm cannon, the largest gun ever mounted on an American aircraft. It turned the Mitchell into something entirely new, a flying gunship. Crews nicknamed them gun-nosed beasts. When they came roaring in low, the sound alone sent Japanese troops diving for cover. They weren't graceful, but they were brutally effective. The B-25's thick wing roots and high-mounted engines gave it remarkable stability, allowing pilots to stay level during firing runs even under heavy recoil. Its simple hydraulic systems meant repairs could be done in muddy jungle strips with little more than wrenches, welding torches, and determination and time. The aircraft became a symbol of reliability, a machine that could be patched up, refueled, and sent back into the storm again and again. The Mitchell didn't just survive the war, it defined it. A bomber that earned respect not because it was flawless, but because it never quit. Behind every roaring B-25 Mitchell, there was a 5-man crew, ordinary men thrown into extraordinary circumstances. They came from farms, factories, and small towns. Some had never even seen an airplane before they enlisted. Yet in the chaos of war, they became a single heartbeat inside a flying fortress. At the controls sat the pilot and co-pilot, 2 young men barely in their 20s, whose hands danced over switches and throttles as if born to it. Behind them, the navigator hunched over his maps, calculating bearings by flashlight while flak thumped outside like distant thunder. In the belly of the plane, the bombardier steadied himself over the Norden bomb site, his job measured in seconds and inches. One wrong calculation, and the mission could fail. And high above the world, the tail gunner sat alone in a glass dome, the wind screaming past as tracer fire stitched the air behind him. These were the men who carried the war's weight on aluminum wings. They learned to trust each other without question, because at 10,000 feet, trust was the only armor that mattered. They painted names on their planes: Betty's Dream, Dirty Dora, Heavenly Body. Each name told a story, a connection to home, a reminder of why they fought. They joked before takeoff, smoked to hide their nerves, and went silent when the engines began to roar. Every mission felt like gambling with fate, but they flew anyway. When they returned, bullet holes patched with tape and engine sputtering, they didn't see themselves as heroes. Just men who did their job again and again, until the war was won. And though most of their names are forgotten, their courage still echoes, in the thunder of the engines, in the gleam of the wings, and in the memory of every B-25 that made it home. War often fuels invention, but in the Pacific, it birthed something extraordinary. Faced with brutal conditions, endless ocean, and a relentless enemy, American engineers and pilots didn't just follow the rulebook, they rewrote it. Every airstrip, every hangar, became a laboratory of survival. Mechanics stripped down bombers in the humid heat, improvising with whatever they could find. Spare parts were scavenged, engines reworked, and armor plates reshaped by hand. Necessity became the mother of audacity. Pappy Gunn, the maverick engineer and pilot, was at the heart of this transformation. To him, good enough was never good enough. He looked at the B-25 Mitchell, a sturdy medium bomber, and saw untapped potential. Its nose was designed for bombing runs, but Gunn envisioned something deadlier. Using salvaged guns, makeshift mounts, and sheer genius, he turned the bomber's nose into a wall of firepower, 8.50 caliber machine guns synchronized to spit lead at 1,200 rounds per minute. It was no longer just a bomber, it became a low-flying storm of destruction. The engineers thought he was crazy.
The brass thought it impossible.
But when Gunn's modified B-25 screamed across the jungle treetops, annihilating Japanese convoys with pinpoint accuracy, disbelief turned to awe. From this chaos of invention emerged a new breed of warfare, gunship bombing, a doctrine born not in laboratories but in the heat of combat. The Pacific skies became a proving ground where raw courage met mechanical brilliance. Every new modification, every bolt tightened by a grease-stained hand, pushed the boundaries of what an aircraft could be. And above it all, one truth remained: when creativity takes flight in the face of destruction, history changes course. August 1943. The dense jungles of New Guinea hid one of Japan's most vital air bases, WWII. It was the heart of their air power in the Pacific, home to hundreds of bombers and fighters. If the Allies could destroy it, they'd cripple Japan's reach across the region. But there was one problem: WWII was nearly untouchable. The Japanese had hidden their planes beneath camouflage nets, surrounded by mountains and guarded by some of the fiercest anti-aircraft guns in the theater. Traditional bombing runs had failed miserably. Every approach cost lives. That's when Pappy guns modified B-25s entered the story. Sleek, fast, and packed with firepower, they were designed to skim just above the treetops. Too low for radar, too fast for the guns. At dawn, they came roaring through the valleys. Their engines howled like thunder rolling across the jungle. Flying barely 50 feet above the canopy, they opened fire before the Japanese even knew they were there. Tracers tore through hangars, fuel tanks, and parked aircraft. In minutes, WWII became an inferno. Flames leapt skyward as Japanese bombers erupted one after another, each explosion feeding the next. The air turned black with smoke, and the ground shook beneath the assault. By the time the B-25s banked for home, over 200 Japanese aircraft lay in ruins. The heart of Japan's air power in New Guinea had been gutted in a single morning. What stunned commanders wasn't just the success, it was how it happened. This was warfare reimagined, precision and chaos fused into one. WWII wasn't just another victory. It was the proof that ingenuity and daring could break even the toughest defenses, and that one man's defiance could rewrite the playbook of air combat forever. The Pacific sky was deceptive, beautiful from above, but deadly below the clouds. For the men of the low-flying B-25 squadrons, every mission meant skimming through hell itself. Flying just 50 feet above the jungle canopy, they were so low they could see palm fronds whip past their wings. Every tree, every hill, every riverbend could hide anti-aircraft guns or a burst of tracer fire. There was no time to dodge, only to endure. The roar of the engines drowned out every other sound, but inside those planes, the tension was deafening. Gunners clenched their triggers, scanning for muzzle flashes in the shadows. The pilot's knuckles turned white as he fought turbulence and gunfire at once. When the B-25s attacked, they did it in unison, an orchestrated storm of metal. 8.50 caliber guns in the nose, side-mounted turrets, tail guns, and even belly guns rained destruction in a single terrifying pass. Enemy convoys simply disappeared beneath the torrent. But the cost was heavy. One engine hit could turn a bomber into a fireball. If a plane went down, survival was a cruel gamble. Even if the crew bailed out, the jungle below was an ocean of green death. Still, they flew. Mission after mission. Because every run that destroyed a Japanese convoy meant one less attack on Allied troops fighting on the ground. In these low-level strikes, courage wasn't a choice, it was instinct. There was no glory in these missions, no grand speeches or medals. Just men defying death every day to keep others alive. For those who survived, the memories never faded. The smell of burning fuel, the flash of tracer rounds, the constant fight between life and oblivion. They called it the hell below the clouds. And no one who flew there ever came back the same. By late 1944, Paul Pappy Gunn had become a legend, though not the kind who sought fame. To the men who flew beside him, he was equal parts genius, madman, and savior. To his superiors, he was a constant headache, a man who ignored rules, rewrote orders, and somehow made miracles out of scrap metal. Pappy wasn't a typical officer. He'd once been an airline mechanic, not a soldier. He spoke the language of engines, not politics. What drove him wasn't ambition, it was obsession. He couldn't stand waste, inefficiency, or anything that cost lives unnecessarily. If he saw a better way, he took it, regulations be damned. There were stories of him flying through storms with one engine, of modifying aircraft in the middle of the jungle using nothing but welding torches and spare Jeep parts, of landing under fire just to fix another man's plane. His crews trusted him blindly because he never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. But behind the rough humor and fearless grin was a man haunted by loss. His family had been captured by the Japanese in the Philippines early in the war. That wound never healed. It burned in every mission he planned, every aircraft he rebuilt to strike harder, fly faster, kill quicker. When he stood beside his gun-nosed B-25, he wasn't thinking about medals or recognition. He was thinking about ending the war, by any means necessary. To the high command, Gunn was unpredictable. To his men, he was unstoppable. And to the enemy, he was invisible, a ghost whose ideas turned ordinary bombers into flying monsters. In the jungles of the Pacific, his legend grew. But so did the shadow he cast, the fine line between brilliance and obsession, between innovation and recklessness. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world began counting what was left: the ruins, the machines, and the men who drove them. The M18 Hellcat, once dismissed as a reckless experiment, stood quietly in that reckoning, scarred, battered, but undefeated. To the untrained eye, it looked almost fragile. Thin armor, open turret, light frame, hardly the image of an unstoppable war machine. But for those who had seen it in motion, that small frame carried something greater than steel, the idea that speed could outthink power. Across Europe, from the frozen forests of Bastogne to the muddy fields of Lorraine, the wrecks of heavier German tanks told the same story, that agility, coordination, and courage could turn less into more. For every Tiger that broke down, a Hellcat was already racing toward another ambush, its engine screaming like a jet of vengeance. The war ended, but the lessons of the Hellcat didn't. In the decades that followed, its philosophy became military gospel: shoot, move, survive. Modern tank destroyers, reconnaissance vehicles, and even missile carriers trace their lineage to the M18's radical simplicity. At Fort Moore, the last restored Hellcat stands beneath an open sky. Its paint is faded, its guns silent, but if you listen closely, you can almost hear the distinct high-pitched whine echoing through the trees, a sound that once froze German crews in their tracks. The Hellcat didn't win the war alone, but it changed how wars would be fought forever. It proved that brilliance isn't always built from armor and might. Sometimes, it's born from speed, daring, and the will to adapt faster than the enemy can think. And for the men who drove them, 3 minutes was all they needed, to fight to win, and to disappear like ghosts into the smoke of victory.